You and Gary had a bit of a frosty relationship in season one. How come?
He wasn't happy. There was a certain amount of professional suspicion, shall we say.
Matt Preston has written a memoir called Big Mouth. It covers his adoption, some shocking family tragedies, his time in the British Army, and of course, his wildly successful showbiz career here in Australia. Matt, thanks for chatting to news.com.au.
Absolute pleasure as always.
This book is an absolute cracker. I don't want to give too much away, but I do want to ask you about some of the stories that are inside Big Mouth, starting with MasterChef. So many people wanted to be a part of this show when it first came to Australia. Can you run us through some of the people who auditioned to be judges?
Certainly Pete Evans was amongst them. Guy Grossi, I thought, would obviously get the job. He's such a great performer. Manu is in there as well, and a whole host of other people who didn't make it through to the next round. But pretty much everyone in Australia was approached and reached out to. I mean, it's interesting that the enthusiasm for getting a role on the show was far greater than the enthusiasm for the rest of Australia to watch the show. I think, that's that thing we forget about MasterChef is when we started, there was very negative. There were lots of top chefs who thought it would be dumbing down food. There were lots of advertisers who couldn't see why anyone would want to watch a show about food and about food when you couldn't taste it or smell it, and especially watch it 5 nights a week. But the genius of this kind of cabal of David Mott at 10 and the Fennessy brothers at what was then Fremantle, and a pretty young producer called Paul Franklin, that they managed to find a magic combination, and it's that which really propelled the success of the show.
So they came to you for advice on who to cast and then ended up casting you. How did that happen?
Well, originally they were only looking for 2 chefs. They were going to go with the UK model. They were going to have 2 chefs, and then rather than a voiceover, they're going to have a female host. So that's what they were doing. The story, the woman who was casting the show, Henry Stride, is now my manager. So I know this story quite well. I've been able to get it firsthand from her. But basically, what happened is it halfway. We talked through the conversation. We talked about half an hour. Halfway through the conversation, I was asked to send a photo. I only had one. It was me looking disapprovingly at a bowl of salad, looking slightly unshaven and slightly, how should we say, shabby chic. And the story goes that the picture went from her desk up the chain of command. It was a guy called Jonathan Summerhays who saw it. He then said, "Oh, this looks interesting," and it went all the way up to the top. And I think the line was, which I've obviously paraphrased for politeness. The line was, "If this person can string a sentence together, we'll write another judging role for him." So basically, but before almost at the point of that first audition, it was like, if I could string a line together, I didn't know this. If I could put a cogent line of dialogue together, they would give me a judging role, and so hence we ended up with George, Gary, and myself judging, and Sarah Wilson as the host.
You mentioned in Big Mouth that you and Gary had a bit of a frosty relationship in season one. How come?
Well, look, I think you have to understand that there is a fundamental Cobra versus mongoose relationship between food critics and restaurateurs. So and it's the same thing with any journalist and any political journalists and political subjects. So to be in the same space, I'm the guy who came to Gary's restaurant at the Boathouse and had a wobbly table and wrote about how wobbly my table was, and he wasn't happy. So there was a certain amount of just that kind of professional suspicion, shall we say. I always cast myself personally as the mongoose, and I cast the boys as the 2 cobras.
So he didn't think that a food critic was worthy of being on the same judging panel as a chef. Is that right?
Oh, no, absolutely not that. No, it was about the delineation of whether the of what role the food writer should have in such a thing. So, for example, back in those first, I was never at the offsite challenges. Now, that seemed fair enough. Day off for me. So there were definitely some structural differences in there, and it was that I think at one time I went. He saw me in the kitchen. It was like, "What's he doing in the kitchen?" Food critics go in the kitchen, and my line was, "Well, mate, if food critics go in the kitchen, then maybe the chefs should say in the kitchen and not come into the dining room." So, but it was, standard stuff. It's standard stuff, and it's always going to be season one of anything is going to be, we're all finding our way. We're all finding our way, and obviously, over the years we became closer and closer. And now Gary's one of my most trusted friends. He's a beautiful human, and we get on exceptionally well.
You reveal a lot of behind the scenes secrets about MasterChef in your book. One of them I found really interesting was this thing that my friends and I have talked about before, that in the early stages of MasterChef, you has to taste and judge so many dishes. And we all know how long filming takes. So some of the dishes are obviously going to be cold by the time they get to you, which gives an unfair advantage to those who get their dishes tasted when they're warm. How did you guys overcome that?
I think one of the great things about MasterChef, in terms of those big tastings where you're tasting 20 dishes, we had a number of strategies to ensure that we could see the food in its best form. In terms of things like they would do a second dish of elements that we would taste in a speed tasting before we did the main tasting. So we'd gone around and looked at things like how high the souffle risen, and were the chips crispy, and what was the pasta like, and all those elements. We also, because we spent pretty much most of the time on the floor during those cooks, we were wandering around the whole time. You'd see us in the back of shot, Gary and George being filmed talking to the contestant, and I'd be in the back of shot, poking into pots and tasting. So that gave us a much better sense, because again, all you're trying to do is you're trying to make the playing field for the contestants as even as possible, and to make the judging as transparent as possible, so everyone gets a chance. But I don't think anyone had ever done anything and tried to find a way to solve it. And I think in the end we came up with the solution that we worked out, as a production, as a show, not the three of us, but as a whole group, a mob of people, was probably the fairest way we could do it.
Texture's good. Basic flavour's good too.
MasterChef was such a big hit in those early seasons. It still is today, of course. But you guys, you three judges, really captured the attention of the paparazzi. They followed you wherever you went in the early days. There's a very fun story in the book about George, who was getting hounded by photographers in Bondi. Can you tell everyone what happened there?
Yeah, well, I think George thought he was being hounded by. There was a photographer that basically camped outside his house in Bondi, and he was and he was like, "That's it, I've got to leave. I can't be in Bondi. Too many paps, and they're camped outside my house." The trouble was, when he actually was moving out and shifting his boxes out, he photographer caught his eye, and he was like, "Well, I'm going." And he said, "Who are you?" And he was basically, the photographer was scoping out someone down the street who was obviously of far more importance than George was. So, yeah, look, I was told that how should we say, a damaging picture. Matt Preston feeding his kindergarten age daughter junk food was worth about 40 grand. So you can understand why photographers were out there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was Lara Bingle, right? That's who.
It was Lara Bingle who was down there. That's absolutely right.
Your wife, Emma, features heavily in this memoir, as you'd expect. You actually came up with a bit of a secret signal to let her know that you were thinking of her while filming MasterChef. What was that?
Yeah, well, look, we were apart. The first 4 years of MasterChef was shot in Sydney. My family lived in Melbourne, so I was basically going up on a Sunday, coming back on a Thursday, and I had to find ways of, when she was watching the show, like letting her know that she was there. So I wear two rings on my. I used to, at that point, we used to wear two wedding rings on my left hand. So I would during tastings, I would twizzle the ring. I'd twist the ring on my finger, which I think is also known as the Prince Charles. It's a very Prince Charles pose, that. I twist the ring on my finger so that she could watch and know that I wasn't just lost in some strange MasterChef celebrity bubble, that I was actually remembering her. And it's at the end of the day, MasterChef, me working in Sydney was easy for me. It was much harder for her with 3 young kids under 6.
In Big Mouth, you write about some of the amazing chefs that have popped up on MasterChef over the years. Heston Blumenthal, Gordon Ramsay, Jamie Oliver, and Nigella Lawson, who once told off George Calombaris off camera. He was doing something that she did not appreciate very much. What was that?
I reckon it was on camera. I reckon it made the cut. I reckon it made the cut. And she was, she's very, she's very correct, Nigella, and she has standards. She has standards. One of those standards is your manners, and I think George was caught licking his knife. And she was like, "What are you doing? You can't do that. That's a disgrace. Your manners. You know, were you raised by wolves?" The upshot of that story, of course, is we ended. I think next year we ended up going to New York, and we were filming in New York for MasterChef with a chef from the 3-star Le Bernardin, Eric Ripert, and we're doing a tasting with him. And about halfway through the tasting, Eric Ripert picks up his knife with a bit of food on it, and George just nudged me and went, "You see, Matt, all the top chefs are doing it."
We have barely touched the surface of all the great stories in Big Mouth. Congratulations on writing the book. It is so interesting, and thanks for chatting to news.com.au.
Absolute pleasure, anytime.